Wondering how to research for your mythology retelling and how to apply that information you uncover? Stick around to find out. Hey all, and welcome to my vlog. My name is Erin, and this is Kat, and this is Demystifying Mythology. Kat is one of my fabulous critique partners, and we've teamed up on this mythology series to help you with your retellings. Today we're talking about research, and this topic in general was requested by one of my patrons over on Patreon, Casey. She wanted to know about writing mythology retellings, so I recruited Kat to help.
If you haven't already checked out the first video in this series, there's going to be a link down in the description. And you can also look forward to upcoming videos about myth selection, character creation, world building, ancient versus modern morality, and writing mythological romance. If you have suggestions on other things about mythology or writing that you'd like to see us talk about, you can leave that down in the comments.
Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and ring that bell so you always know when a new video is uploaded. And I will have all of Kat's links in the description below. If you have not already subscribed to her, get on that. Source material versus creative works. How do you determine the difference between sources and creative work?
Mythology is typically hella old. It's been centuries since the days when the myths were just part of everyday life, and you're not the first person to want to retell them. In fact, 99% of what people have consumed about Greek, Norse, and Egyptian mythology have been stylized and repackaged for modern consumption. I mean, Cronus cuts off his father's penis and throws it into the water, and then that's how Aphrodite is born. Disney's Hercules didn't tell you that, did it?
If you're set on retelling mythology, it's important for you to forget what you think you know and open yourself up to the original sources. Thor and Loki aren't brothers, Hades is not a stand-in for Satan, and mythology is way gayer than a lot of modern retellings would have you believe. But how can you be sure that you know you're using the facts?
You have to read really old books. For example, Norse mythology has only a few sources: the Prose Edda, the Poetic Edda, the Codex Regius, and the Gesta Danorum. Basically, every written source after this has been based on those 4 books. And because these cultures passed down their stories verbally for hundreds of years, everything that wasn't written down was lost.
Greek mythology has a few decent sources, such as Hesiod's Theogony, which covers the gods' origins and genealogies, Ovid's Metamorphoses, which covers any myth that has to do with transformations, such as Pygmalion, Apollo and Daphne, and King Midas, etc. You've also got the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, and countless other poems that have survived, thankfully, till the modern day. These are all oral pieces that were since written down and translated a lot, so take that into consideration when you're reading them.
While there's nothing wrong with drawing inspiration from retellings, if you can't tell fact from fiction, your myth-educated readers are going to do it for you, and you are not going to enjoy that. Reading the sources themselves can be a painful slog if you're not into that kind of language, but research is something that you have to learn to love. Think of it as treasure hunting for details. You'll learn a lot and your writing will benefit from it, which means that you and your readers will benefit from it as well.
Retellings can definitely inspire you to look up certain things, but if your sources are Tom Hiddleston as Loki or Brad Pitt as Achilles, you're gonna run into some problems. Traditional fact versus spiritual fact, modern paganism versus the ancient myth. How does this affect the story?
Mythology is also based on religion. People once believed in these gods, and in fact, there are still plenty of people all around the world who still worship these old gods. We also tend to assume that the word mythology refers to a long-dead tradition, but that's not always the case. There are cultures all around the world that practice living, breathing mythology every day, such as Indigenous Americans, or Hindu belief systems. This plays into your research in 2 primary ways.
First, respect. These practicing religions deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, and if you can't do that, you should consider writing a different story. Your beliefs don't have to mesh with theirs, but it's very important that you don't go around bashing these belief systems, because that is not a good look.
Second, discerning spiritual belief from traditional fact. Fact is a hard term to use when you're researching an intangible ancient tradition, but if you do the reading, you can find lots of things to base your research on. For example, I have a stack of books on Norse mythology. One of these books focuses on Seithr, a type of magic specific to the Scandinavian region. It has a lot of great information, but it focuses a lot more on modern practices. We know for a fact that very few of the traditional practices were passed on over time, and the author admits that a lot of the things in the book are based on best guesses from things like the sagas. Another book, however, is about archaeology and the examination of old texts. This book looks at what is known and what can be interpreted from actual findings. For me, the second book was much more valuable when trying to create something that was based on actual traditions instead of modern spiritual practices.
How do you track down source material?
Tracking down these sources shouldn't be incredibly tricky. Many of the sources are now old enough to fall under the public domain and are available for free online as ebooks. You can also snag physical copies for pretty affordable prices if you're that kind of nerd. You should be able to find the names of these sources on sites like Wikipedia, and once you have your hands on the main books, you can find more sources by searching online, consuming content by respected scholars, or checking the back of a lot of your textbooks in the recommended reading section.
For a lot of Greek mythology, there's a pretty good chance that you've come across them at least at some point in your education. Most people that I know were forced to read the Iliad or the Odyssey in high school, so you might already have a decent basis going on. Any of the Greek sources should be readily available at your library, and I'm going to put a link in the description about Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. She's the first woman to translate it into English, and it gives you a really good idea of why modern translations can be so difficult and why you should take them with a grain of salt when you're reading.
Which brings up a great point. Translation is an imperfect art. I have 2 copies of the Prose Edda. One is older than the other, and not a single one of the pages is identical. One example reads, "In the likeness of Loki, ever eager for harm," and the other one reads, "That evil-loving form Loki is recognized." These things can be frustrating, but you can also use them to your benefit when working on your retelling.
Some of your research will take you to very expensive textbooks, and no one wants to drop $300 on a book that might not be useful to them. Search the selection on Abe Books' website first. They sometimes have used copies for a much more reasonable price. You can also check upcoming prints of rare books, and it's also good to check out local and regional libraries to see what sources they have. You can also look into your local university or college libraries because free books are the best books.
Not all research books are built the same. Some will have a plethora of information for you, while others will be called myths from around the world and will only mention Odin once. When possible, try to check out these books from your local library to give them a peek first before you invest money into something that isn't going to help you at all.
One of my favorite resources for Greek mythology is theoi.com. I don't know if I said it right, but there'll be a link so you don't need to know how to spell it. It's essentially clinically translated myths without any kind of personal spin, and it's very easy to look up specific players in the mythologies and find every single myth that they show up in. I personally would also recommend reading some of the epic poems, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, not only because it will give you an overview of a lot of the mythologies, but it's going to give you a peek into everyday life at the time. Checking out info from archaeological sites can also be really interesting. There are cities everywhere that are dedicated to specific gods, and the archaeological records can give you some decent insight as to what was going on at the time. Athens is the most obvious one for Athena. There was also Ephesus for Artemis, Argos for Hera, and tons of others.
Greek, Roman, and Egyptian mythologies are some of the more popular ones, and they get a lot of shelf space in physical stores. Sadly, in my experience, this was not true for Norse mythology. If you're looking for anything outside of the big 3, you may find it a challenge. In that case, the internet really is your best friend. Bookshops can't afford to stock everything, but there are lots of books that still exist about these smaller mythologies. Oh, and when somebody drops the term classical mythology, that is always referring to Greek and Roman mythologies and doesn't have anything to do with anyone else. My mistake.
There are so many things beyond just the basic mythology that you need to consider in your research. What goes on in your story is likely to be heavily influenced by the time period and the location that you choose. You have plenty of flexibility, but you've got to put in the work to get that authenticity. Remember that there are going to be huge differences in lifestyles between places like Athens, Sparta, or Ilium. You have to learn what you can about the specific cultures for the locations that you choose for your story and any that your characters are going to be traveling to. This applies to the modern day as well. We know that there's huge differences in lifestyle between places like Tokyo, Paris, or Los Angeles. Setting it in the modern day is not an excuse to get lazy with your research. And if you want to skip out of writing about ancient times when the myths are actually happening, or the modern day, there's tons of flexible choices. You can pick literally any time and anywhere. Maybe you want to mix it up and have the Greek gods appearing during the Greek War of Independence, or the Norse gods appearing when the Black Plague hits Norway. Whatever you pick, you've got a buttload of research ahead of you.
I suggest sitting down and making a checklist of all the things that you're going to need for your story. For example, perhaps you have chosen to give your love interest character PTSD. Have you researched the condition? Does your character exist in a time after PTSD was clinically acknowledged, or are they going to assume that they have been perhaps possessed by a demon of some sort? If it's the latter, have you done research on the Egyptian version of a demon and how exactly that might play into your plot? What solution might that culture have had to that kind of condition, and so forth?
That's a good point and something that you'll notice in trying to write any kind of historical. This isn't necessarily mythology specific, but I know when I was trying to write my historical fiction, I gave my character postpartum depression at a time when it was not universally acknowledged as even being a thing. It was not well known, it was not well understood, so you have to find this balance of how that's all going to work. How do you get your readers to understand that your character is going through something specific when you can't just say what it is? In my case, no matter how many symptoms I put in that were common for postpartum, there were still a couple betas that thought she was a heartless bitch.
Culture will also be one of your key research points. Decide where and when your story is going to take place. Research that culture so you understand what exactly daily life was like, how the gods were worshipped, what people ate, what they thought of sexuality, etc. Even if you currently live in Greece or Norway, it doesn't guarantee you a working knowledge of how the ancient peoples lived and existed in their daily lives, especially if your schooling has kind of skimmed over or blurred out some of the details. There are cultures in which the original traditions were buried and put aside when Christianity came along. There are cultures in which original traditions were buried or put aside when Christianity came along. So it's always best practice to assume you know nothing and hit the books. It can be tempting to cut corners here, and some retellings will allow for that more than others. My work in progress, The Goddess of Nothing at All, is set in Viking Age times. However, it also takes place in the fantastical city of Asgard. I've imagined the city as having access to rune-powered magics, to books and conveniences, and commonly used written language, all things which people in Viking Age Norway would not have had access to. I'm essentially banking on the idea that gods would have had more advanced society than humans. This gives me room to be creative, but I've also worked really hard to stay close to the culture that the myths originated from.
That's something that I considered as well. My leads are gods, and majority of the story takes place on Olympus or in the underworld or in other deity-only areas. Fantasy locations can help, but that didn't stop me from having to learn about death rituals, worship locations, and all that kind of stuff. When you proceed to write without the facts, your brain is going to fill in the facts for you, and that's when you make a fool of yourself. For example, when we think of love, we think of marriage. But before you go hitching your two characters, make sure that you understand their culture's marriage practices. For example, wearing a white wedding dress is something that we attribute to weddings now, but that didn't really become popular until the 1940s for the average person. And Vikings were recorded as exchanging rings, but you don't want to go sticking a 5-carat diamond on one of those. Diamond rings can be traced back to 1477 Vienna, but they didn't become popular until a marketing campaign in 1947. Our traditions are not everyone's traditions.
We're going to be creating a video for world building for mythology retellings, which will help you create a longer list of details that you'll need to research, but don't wait for us. You can already get started.
How do you use the research you've done? That's going to depend wildly on your book. Research can lead you down all kinds of paths and open up tons of possibilities. The smallest details could hugely influence your plot or your characters, or it could just be a fun detail to include.
For example, reading one single line about shamanism completely changed one of my characters from the core. But on the other hand, learning something about Viking Age wood carvings just added a little decor to one of the rooms. The best thing to do is to keep a lot of notes about things that you find interesting, and you can decide later if that's appropriate to add to chapter 29. Don't be afraid to bookmark things or use post-it notes if that's what helps you find those details later. Another important note for people who aren't used to researching: you don't need to read a book cover to cover. You should take time to skim through and make sure that you're not missing important details, but you don't need to read 2 chapters on how the Romans harvested their food if that's not relevant to your plot.
What you use will also depend on your target audience and subgenre. If you're writing a romance or an erotica, you might be interested in some ancient sex rites. But if you're writing a middle grade fantasy, you can probably skip over the ancient torture techniques and instead focus on children and how they were perceived and cared for in society.
Research can be difficult, especially if you're not used to it and you don't know what direction to start in, but we believe in you. We're going to stick a bunch of the references that we talked about in the section below. You can also feel free to ask questions in the comments section if you have them, and we'll do our best to help guide you along.
So that is all we've got for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to Casey for requesting this topic. If you would like the chance to request a topic for my channel, you can do so on my Patreon. We've got all kinds of fun stuff going on, like a writing group, early access to videos, a chance to pitch a video topic, and the opportunity to have me help hash out your story. Thank you so much to Kat for joining me for this episode of the series. Kat, tell everyone where they can find you.
I have my own channel where I talk about tropes, the writing process, and sometimes the psychology of book marketing. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, both under the name cat_rector, and you'll find the links down below. Feel free to poke me on either platform if you'd like to know more about the Norse mythology resources that I have, because I know that finding them is such a pain in the ass.
All 3 of my books, Heart and Soul, Olympian Confessions, Hades and Persephone, and Olympian Confessions, HERA, are on sale right now. You can check out the first 3 chapters for free on my website. All the relevant links for that will be below. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to be notified as soon as I upload, then ring that bell. All our social media links will be in the description below. Make sure that you follow Kat so you can get all the updates on the Goddess of Nothing at All. I will see you next week in another video, and Kat and I will both see you in the next installment of Demystifying Mythology. Bye!